Hello and welcome to This Is Your Life Path, a podcast where I sit down with tabletop game designers and we have a chat about all of the things that have influenced and inspired them away from the tabletop world. I'm your host Kayla, I'm a game designer myself and I publish as Ratwave Gamehouse. I do games all about connection and alienation. Games like Follow Me in the Night, A Cursed Radio, a solo journaling and playlist making game about self-exploration, music, magic, and pain. Now to jump into the episode and introduce today's guest. Hello, my guest today is a game maker with a verifiable treasure trove of games released as Roll Flip Draw, and a theatre maker in the interactive space who recently did multiple showings of a show called The Shield and Torch, which was a sort of melding of interactive theatre with elements of sort of adventure stories, right? And I should say your name. How do I pronounce your name? I realized I was going to ask this before we started recording, and then I didn't.
That's fine. It's just Chloe Mashiter. It's very
Mashita.
much in my brain. It's just you say it how it's spelled, but that's as someone who has it's been my name my whole life. So of course I think you say it how it's spelled.
That is, to be fair, what I would have gone for. I was just suddenly like, I'm going to look like a twat if I go and then you're like, no, it's Mashita or something.
That's weirdly that's yeah. A lot of people Mashita, etc. It's always it's the shit slap bang in the middle of the surname that seems to throw
It
people off
worries
a bit.
people. They don't know what to do with it.
Hmm.
How are you doing
Very
today?
All right. It's one of my days off. I've been doing just all of the boring things, but the boring good things. So like buying food and doing laundry and trying to do the things that are taking care of yourself, but in a very like admin based fashion.
Yeah, the recuperation part of rest and recuperation, which isn't always restful.
Yes, precisely. How are
Cool.
you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm on holiday while I'm recording. I say holiday. I'm on half term, so I am very much in my flat, um, doing the same things I ordinarily do after work, but just I didn't have a work to go to first.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're, I guess, gonna dive into. I was about to say your backstory, which I'm like, that's such a weird way to talk about real people.
My origin story.
Yes. When were you bitten by a radioactive game designer slash theatre maker? But yeah, no. First, we both live in London. But did you grow up in London or did you move here?
I moved here. I grew up in Norwich in Norfolk, and that was like I was born there. I lived there for like the first 19 years of my life. Um, and then after university, a few different coincidences meant that I moved down to London to work on theatre things. And for the fair chunk of the last decade or so, aside from some stints in Plymouth and Southampton, I've been living and working in London.
Ah, cool, cool. So, did you just say you studied in Norwich as well before coming up, or did I
No,
mishear
it's
something?
it's a genuine tick I have that I will say I've gone to uni and I won't say where. I'll skirt over it. I went to uni in Cambridge, and people who like work in theatre who went to Cambridge, are, like there is a very specific type, and there's disproportionately way too many of us around, and things like that. And also sometimes you meet people who really show off about having gone there, and it's like give it a rest. Um, but yes, I grew up in Norwich, uni in Cambridge. Then most of the time since then has been in London.
Cool, yeah. What's Norwich like to grow up in? Like, is it?
I personally love it. Like,
Ah,
I'm a big fan of Norwich. I'm not one of those people who kind of grows up, goes to uni, and is like, screw my hometown. It sucks. Uh, like, I really like it because it's a city, but obviously it's nothing like the scale of Norwich. It's nothing like the scale of London. Um, the center of town is all like pedestrianized. it has different laws about busking, so you get a lot more buskers just out on the street, some of whom have weird cult status. Like there'll be Facebook groups kind of dedicated to, the guy with the puppets and stuff like that.
Oh,
Um,
puppet busking. That's sick.
that Yeah, that was a big the puppet man, which sounds kind of sinister, but it wasn't. Was a popular like odd feature of Norwich when I was a teenager. And then you have the marketplace in the center of town, which is just such a lovely kind of hub of different food places. And it's the odd mix of the places that have been there for like 20, 30 years that just sell different types of vacuum bags. And then the places that are like vegan pulled pork stalls and stuff. Um, but I think it's a really nice place to grow up in because it's kind of small enough that it still feels homely. It's quite picturesque in parts. There are bits of it that are very popular as film sets because it's got that kind of medieval cobbled street vibe, but it's big enough that there's enough stuff to do. Like you're
Mm.
not just kind of kicking around a bus stop or something. You can actually do things. Um, and I really, really like Norwich. I don't tend to visit that much, just due to kind of like work and stuff. But when I do, I really enjoy going back there.
Yeah. As someone, I guess, who has like a huge affection for the place you grew up, but then is mainly making all theatre in London and any other work you do you ever feel like you are bringing sort of elements or memories or experiences of your home to your work, or is it not something that enters into your mind much?
There's definitely some ways in which it's pretty explicit or deliberate. Like the shield and torch that you mentioned, that's the second project under like a kind of banner called Along Me. The previous one being a remote project in 2021 that was about people playing solo games, solo LARPs, etc., and all feeding in separately to like a core hub of world building together, and also some streams that were opportunities for people remotely to all contribute to this one world building. And Along Me is taken from Norfolk dialect because like I've made it all one word, but it's Along Me, which means like along with me, with me. Um,
Oh.
and that was a very deliberate thing where I was like, I really love Norfolk dialect and stuff like that. So it's nice to include that. I've got like some other games that I've made where they'll sometimes be like a table, and it'll be there's one game that was part of a an advent calendar of me just making a game like every other day because I normally do like pretend advent calendars of just like throwing out ideas for 25 days. And recently
Was
I did
that
one where I
this
was like,
year's advent calendar or a previous year?
it was the most recent one, the 2022 one. And one of those games was one that I like play tested. I was so ready to do it as like a bigger thing, and I just kind of needed to get it out of my system, as it were. And that one is set in a very specific village in Norfolk that I knew quite well called Clyde next to Sea. It has like a fate table that is all based around Norfolk dialect and stuff like that. So there's very like specific explicit stuff where there's an influence. In terms of like anything that's more ephemeral, I don't know because I definitely like the community size of Norwich and the kind of feel of it. That kind of mix of being like obviously like an urban city, but so close to nature and being heavily pedestrianized and not feeling quite as kind of overwhelming as London. But I'm not sure like what other ways that I'm not clocking it might manifest in the stuff I make, to be honest.
Sure, yeah, it's one of those things where, given it's the environment that surrounds you, I'm like it's hard to be aware of what you've carried with you from that. But that's really interesting answer. So when you were a a young kid in Norwich, I don't know why I've started narrating this.
No, I love it. It's a picture.
What is it that you like? What do you have? Do you have much memories of knowing what you wanted to be when you were older, or were you feeling things out the whole time?
Oh, I can give you like a very specific. When I was 4, I wanted to be a banana. Um, and when I was like 7 to 14, I wanted to be an Egyptologist because I was heavily into ancient Egypt, heavily into archaeology, loved the idea of like kind of brushing away dirt from something and discovering something that changed how we understood the world. Um, but then from like kind of about 13, 14 onwards, it was theatre. It
Mm.
was like, maybe I'm not going to be an actor, but I'd really like to be an actor because I think when you're a teenager, acting is the thing that you get to do at school or after school club or something. It's much more unlikely that you're kind of getting experience of what it's like to be a dramaturg or what it's like to be, you know, a techie of some sort, etc. So basically, from like early teens, I wanted to be working in theatre. Um, I hadn't like played tabletop games or kind of games like that when I was that age. I'd only really played stuff like it was kind of the stuff you play with your family. It was like Uno and things like that, or one or two like murderous mystery box set nights with friends. Basically, was the closest I came to
Yeah, that is a
tabletop role.
sort of weird starter form almost of RPGs a lot. Like I feel a
Yeah.
lot of people don't count that in their head when they're like, when did they first do stuff? Even though it is, I don't know. I guess it depends on how you do it. It often does involve playing a character.
Oh, we were very much like we're all gonna get dressed up. We're gonna do accents. Really enjoy it. And actually, now I think back, there's when I was 11, and I kind of wish I still had this much energy and like the energy and conviction of an 11-year-old. I convinced the teachers at my school um, to give us there were like two lessons every week that would kind of like it would change every week what you would do, so they could kind of focus on different things or like try and fill in interesting stuff. Um, if it's not already obvious, private school. Um, so I convinced my teachers to give us those two lessons one week for me and like 7 other mates who I'd corralled to do a murder mystery because I was huge into Agatha Christie. I loved that stuff. And so ended up coordinating some with my friends where it was like a friend outside the classroom would scream. I would burst in wearing a trench coat with like a painted on moustache, being like, "There's been a murder," and take everyone out of the classroom. And then we gathered the suspects in like the assembly hall. Whoever got it right got a book token. Very like late 90s,
Did they have
early
to
noughties.
justify it with like a denouncement though, or they won't get the book token? Did
They
they have
had
to
to
do
say
the
who
kind
did
of
it
Poirot suite
and why.
speech?
It wasn't quite that grand. I hadn't grasped the staging of things that well yet. It was you just handed in like your piece of paper that said who did it and why they did it. Um, so like that those kind of bits were the closest to like say the stuff that I do now. Weirdly, it feels like there is a bit of a full circle thing sometimes from doing that stuff at 11. Um, but yeah, all throughout my teens, and it became much more so towards my late teens, I wanted to be an actor. I applied to drama school, didn't get into a single one of them. I tried really hard at like all the acting opportunities I could do. My sixth form teachers told me I was trying too hard at acting, and that I would be better at other things in theatre. Um, yeah, and I that was the big thing that I wanted to do, like for a good chunk of my teenage years.
Like a real, you know, lifelong passion almost.
Yeah, very much like I'm gonna do the school play. I'm gonna buy scripts on the weekends and just like read scripts to better understand them. I'm gonna do after school drama. I'm gonna apply and do like a couple of weeks with National Youth Theatre. Um, all of those kind of things to be like, yeah, I'm gonna have a go and I'm gonna really try to be an actor.
Yeah, I wish
Um,
I still had like the passion of like my 14-year-old self in terms of like deciding and like really trying to bullet point plan like how do I become this thing. Whereas I feel as an adult, I'm just like just floating around.
yeah, yeah. I feel like part of it is when you're 14, that's potentially like so many decisions and so many choices are taken off your plate or like are
Mm.
never even a thing you have to deal with. So you can just be like, well, I'm gonna go full force at this choice point. Um, basically.
Yeah, that probably is a lot of it actually as well. So I guess on that note, like, you said you had like this introduction to theatre. Did that mainly come through like the educational context you were in? You think like teachers, drama classes, or did you have a sort of falling in love point that was outside of the classroom?
I don't know if I can remember a specific falling in love point. Like I'd always enjoyed performing. I'd always enjoyed to an extent staging things and like putting things on. I remember doing like mini village fates in my garden for my grandparents, like just making Splat the Rat and like dart throw games and stuff, and then like having them come in and go to the bric-a-brac stall and stuff. Um, and I'm not quite sure where some of it came from because, like, from a family context, my parents would take us to the theatre normally for like big musicals because that's kind of what would be good for like a family of five. Um, and so I saw like a lot of musicals growing up, and I remember that I really enjoyed them. Like, I remember asking to go to one for my 13th birthday, and that was like a really big treat. Um, and then obviously I got introduced to some bits and pieces through school. There's a company called Theatre Delicatessen who uh, both like provide spaces for people, but kind of started out um, doing site specific shows. And I'm pretty sure I saw like their first show on a school trip to London when I was like in sixth form. Um,
Ah,
and so it's the kind of thing where you're like in sixth form and you see Midsummer Night's Dream done across different rooms in an office block, and you're like, ah, I've not seen something like this before. Um, yeah, I think it kind of came from that because Norwich has an interesting theatre scene. I mean, it has like a big theatre royal, and then it has a couple of smaller places. It's got like the Playhouse, which is often a lot more comedy stuff, but does some uh, kind of more theatrical bits. And then the Madam Market Theatre, which is an old, almost medievalish, I think, theatre. And then it's got the Puppet Theatre, which is, I think, I hope it still exists. I haven't checked, and I do remember going on a
oh,
protest march to raise money for it because it had like, I think it had a load of Arts Council funding cut when I was about 16, 17. And so
shit.
there was an awareness march through Norwich where like half of the marches were just life-size puppets that people were carrying. Um, I remember trying to like get my friends to come and talk to everyone else at school who like liked drama and no one else would come. So I went to this protest march. It was my first protest march.
Surrounded by
About like
puppets.
this, yeah, I think
You
it's one
had
of
different,
two.
very different expectations for your second protest march, like showing up like, where's all the puppets?
Yeah, very different vibes. Um, but yeah, I think it like it had its funding cut. And it's like one of two dedicated puppet theatres in the entire country.
Damn, I hope
Um,
that is still around.
then a mysterious funder stepped in and saved it, and it was like yay! Because
Ah,
I remember seeing some bizarre but beautiful things there. Um, so I think like the general context of Norwich probably helps. My mum has always been into theatre and probably enjoyed having me as like someone who would be willing to go see stuff with her. Um, and then yeah, it was always just fun doing stuff with the Theatre Royal Saturday classes, getting introduced to new plays, and there's also the Norwich and Norfolk Festival, which I remember would be like, oh, there's suddenly shipping containers in the middle of town that you could go into and do like a one-on-one interesting experience for a bit. So I think it probably a lot of it probably emerged from stuff like that, to be honest.
that makes sense. Yeah, like just that sort of immersion and constant exposure. I remember Theatre Delhi is actually where I did like two wrestling shows in one of their venues before they closed down. But so on that note, when were you first introduced to sort of like tabletop or live action like role playing games? And in the context they were introduced to you, did you immediately sort of grasp this connection to theatre in that area, or is that something that you feel that you brought to that later?
So I think my first introduction which is always interesting, especially if people's first introduction is through like media. I feel like it's really telling like which bit of media um is their thing. And for me, it's the community Dungeons and Dragons episode. I know there's
Oh, yeah.
multiple ones, but it's the first one was my first introduction. Um, and that was obviously really interesting because I'd heard of Dungeons and Dragons before. I have a very specific memory, which is going to the old Dungeons and Dragons movie, like back in 2002 or 2001 maybe. Um, but going because it was a like a 12 certificate and I was 11 and I was like, ooh.
Oh, I'm gonna get
So
away with something.
I know, look at me, I'm so cool. And so I obviously had an awareness of Dungeons and Dragons before that, but I think that was the first time I remember watching that episode. And a big part of the episode is how the character Neil has a massive sword. Like his character has this huge sword that's like a family relic, and Pierce steals it from him and wipes his butt with it and is really disrespectful. And everyone else is like, stop doing this. And I remember watching that episode and being like, okay, but how can that? I don't get how that can be so important because it's like a thing that you've made up in this game. And you say that it's like a family heirloom and you worked really hard to get it, but I can't process how what you mean of working really hard to get it. What did you just like say that your character worked hard to get it? I can't understand the value of this imaginary item in this context because it's people around a table and stuff. However, obviously, after starting to play it, I understand how things do, like, there are things you can slowly work towards in game where it might not be the same amount of time or effort that your character's putting in, but it is like, it's a process. And I can now look back at that episode and be like, oh, I totally understand, like, the relationship that both Neil and Neil's in game character would have had to that thing and how it would have taken time to get that sword and why it's an achievement and how it's important. Um, so yeah, that was my first introduction, and through that, I remember looking at things like Harmon Quest and starting to like dip into bits and pieces of actual plays to get a bit of a sense of stuff. And it was maybe, gosh, like a few months after that that I was like, okay, I want to stage this at Edinburgh Fringe. I guess I'm going to have to play it so that I understand it in order to stage it. My approach was initially completely, I'm playing D&D so that I know how to stage it,
Right,
um,
yes.
rather than I'm just going to play this because I want to play it.
So was it trying to engage with D&D on this idea of staging it and then thinking of the challenges of staging it? Is that what sort of first got you into game design?
I think so, because before then I'd had like experience of bits of game design because of through interactive and immersive theatre, which is what I'd mainly been working in. I mean, I'd been working in that for like 5 years or so by the time I got introduced to tabletop games. And I know I'm kind of blurring tabletop games and D&D. My introduction was, like many people's, via D&D. Um, and whilst I've been working in immersive and interactive theatre, at times that was people who like ran their own street gaming companies, or puzzle gaming things, or you know, people would refer to certain things that we were getting audience members to do in shows as quests or things like that. So there was kind of always like a background of game design bits and pieces, but as part of performance stuff or like the same vocabulary being used in different ways, etc. And so in like the most kind of deliberate, concerted way, yeah, prepping a D&D game for staging it over the course of a month was like my introduction to game design, and to go, how are we going to do this? Because we're going to simplify the character sheets, because if someone's sitting down for an hour, this character sheet is massive and has stuff that's going to be intimidating and not useful. So it was also going, okay, there's this way of playing D&D, and then what do we have to shift and what are we changing about that in order to play the game of D&D that we're going to play for the staged version. Um, so there was a lot of stuff about how are we gonna induct new players into this, because we were selling tickets so that people could watch the game, but also so that people could play. Um,
So
and
the
also,
audience was also participants in the game. Was that?
yeah, basically people could either buy a ticket to just watch, um, or they could watch it on a live stream as well if they like weren't in Edinburgh, or they could buy tickets to play. And some people would buy tickets to watch, and then after doing that, they'd buy tickets to play so they could hop on after they understood what was going on. Some people just watched, though there was a lot of like talking to the audience and back and forth, and sometimes there'd be some suggestions. Or people would just like buy tickets to play. There was a really interesting mix of, you'd have forever DMs playing on stage whilst their groups of players watch them in the audience, because that was a really fun dynamic for them to like witness. You had families where it was like a dad who'd played first edition with a kid who'd never played before, like playing together on stage. Um, you had like teenagers with their families in the audience, like showing their family what their hobby, the thing they were into was. Uh,
Ah,
it was a really interesting like mix of seeing lots of different people. I think someone came on their birthday, which was such a lovely thing. Um, but because we were kind of trying to accommodate people that had potentially played it for years and people who'd never played it before, that informed a lot of the design of the event, as it were, and how we were approaching the game.
yeah. So obviously, I assume there's a case of, oh, we're simplifying things so an audience member can grasp it quickly if they have no background, but also it needs to be recognizable enough that someone with all of that experience is not having to do too much conversion. Was that kind of the challenge there?
Yeah, it's kind of going. You need to give someone who knows D&D what they're expecting, but you also need to support someone who has no idea what to expect.
Yeah, and it's completely difficult to anticipate beforehand going into planning what your audience would actually be, and it sounds like it was hugely varied.
Yeah, it felt pretty varied in terms of like age, gender, um, like experience of games, things like that. I'll be very blunt. One of the ways in which I'm not pointing out is like ethnicity or race, because I will be very open, it wasn't, uh, for various reasons, including like the general context of people who are up at the fringe, also people who are going to look at a D&D themed event and go, that is for me. Um, Especially because it was our first time doing it and the team behind it was all white. So obviously the kind of space that suggests is only going to immediately feel safe to a lot of people, to a certain bracket of people. Um, but yeah, it was really interesting seeing the scope of different people um, get involved in the game. And it was really lovely, because for a lot of people, I think it was the thing of, on the one hand, tabletop games are something with a low barrier to entry, because it's sit round a table or sit at a computer screen on a Zoom call and say things with friends. Um, on the other hand, it's okay, so you've got this book here that's 100 pages, this one here that's 150, which you don't need to read. But to be honest, even though someone else is responsible for reading it, you'll have a better understanding if you do read that book. And then also get ready to like spend at least 6 hours on your first thing while you're setting everything up. And then, well, you might want to write up a backstory if you can, like all that stuff. Um, and for a lot of people, it was like a nice way of dipping their toe in and being like, yeah, cool, I'll just do this for an hour and I'll get a sense of what it is, which I think was appealing to a variety of people.
So from then, that's obviously like designing in the space of performing. Do you remember when you first published one of your own games?
Um, I don't remember exactly when it was. Um, I want to say, oh, it must have been like mid 2019. I remember it was called Bound. There's like an updated, slightly tidied version, I think, maybe still on my itch page. Um, and it was made for a very specific jam. I can't remember what game jam it was made for, but it was like I need a deadline, basically. And that was the first one that I made, but I kind of made it and just like put it there just as a okay, I've done a thing. Because the idea of doing anything more with it, like telling people that it existed or like trying to make any money from itch or things like that just seems like quite a big thing. And I remember the reason I know it must have been mid 2019 is because at the end of 2019 I was at Tabletop Live. I think that was the name of the con.
Was that the
At
one in
Alexandra Palace.
Manchester?
It was one in Alexandra Palace. It was the
Ah.
magazine.
Oh, yes. I've never been, but I know the magazine.
Yeah, I'm like I'd it's the only time I've been to it, and I had the very, very good fortune there to have a coffee with Mads Hamilton, who's one of the folks that runs Rowan Brick and Deckard. And Mads uh, has been amazing on multiple occasions of like talking to me because they're someone who has a lot of experience uh, as it happens with like kind of the live gaming side of things that I do, but also the like tabletop and the publishing and the kind of nuts and bolts of a business stuff. And Maz basically, amongst various other things, kind of gave me the permission that I needed to just make the itch page and do the thing and start publishing games. Um, and so it was only in like late 2019 that I started publishing things with a view to telling people about games that I'd made, really. Um, yeah, yeah.
Would you want to talk about Bound and what that was a bit more?
I can talk about it a bit. I don't remember it hugely. I remember doing like one play of it after I'd published it. I know that the conceit is that you're all playing a group of people in a, you're playing a group of people in a situation. It's to do with curses. I know that it's card based because you're kind of drawing cards and it's whether you can pass on a curse to someone else, etc., or whether you can defeat the curse before dawn. So it's kind of location agnostic because it can be you're in a western and you're all in the jailhouse and you've got to find a way to escape before dawn, or it can be it's a cyberpunk dystopia and you're in, you know, this evil company's headquarters, escape before dawn. And it was about people being connected to each other and trying to encourage role like slightly vaguely PvP role play. Um, Going, not everyone's gonna get out of this night alive type thing. And that's literally the most that I can tell you off the top of my head about it.
No, that
Which,
makes sense. I also struggle to remember anything of games I made like even a year ago.
yeah, there are some that are a bit more sharp in my mind, but I think that one I've also kind of gone, I'm glad that I made it. I did some tidying to kind of make some bits make more sense after I play it with some friends. Um, but it's not one that I hold up and I go, look at these things that I made. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that's understandable. Well, that's interesting because you said it was like card based. I guess I was wondering in that sense, you know, given your introduction was D&D, before you began publishing yourself, had you already at that point gone on a journey of discovering much of the weirder indie scene?
I'm trying to figure out like when that happened for me, like discovering more indie stuff. So I think I must have found a variety of indie games in 2019 solely because I remember being I remember looking at games and buying games and like occasionally like playing different stuff with friends and going, oh, I fully don't understand the appeal of solo tabletop games. There are a lot of solo tabletop games coming up when I'm looking through these searches. I don't understand the appeal of them. And I remember thinking that solely because 2020 then happened and I got heavily into solo tabletop games. Um, so I must have been looking at stuff most likely on itch in 2019. Um, and I know that like me and my friends before that point, oh, of course, sorry, I'm this is where I kind of like realize I'm skating over stuff. Um, when, oh gosh, when did we start doing it? I think late 2017. Um, because I was staging tabletop games as theatre. Started running a monthly night, which was like non D&D games. Basically, was the thing. It was like indie games as theatre. So it was your Ten Candles, your Dreads, Wizard Cops, Lady Blackbird, some like Grant Howitt one pages, as well as Warrior Poet, things like that. My Little Pony, um, and that was how I basically searching for games that would make sense to do as like that kind of monthly alt night. That I was like, I see how this could like work well with a group of people on stage. That was kind of how I approached indie games as well. Because I remember being introduced to stuff like Ten Candles and going, oh my god, it's so theatrical. Like recording the messages at the beginning, playing them back at the end. Once by the point you've forgotten that they existed, as well as the whole lighting setup. Um, yeah, so actually, yeah, from like 2017 onwards, I was kind of looking at indie games and trying to find interesting stuff there.
Yeah, and often specifically with the approach of how can this be taken to the stage?
Yeah, so there are obviously some games where because of the physical components, they make a lot of sense. Like Dread, Ten Candles, they have that clear physical thing that is either like such a palpable representation of the tension in Dread, or it's just like very kind of atmospheric with the candles. And then sometimes it would be stuff like, okay, so we've got Wizard Cops. It's a really fun, silly conceit. Let's just also give everyone like sunglasses and like badges and just go really kind of campy and silly with it. And we've got like red and blue lights that we can do for when the wizard cops are in town. Um, Granted, I don't know because like that was 6 years ago. I don't know how I would approach staging a game even that is even very jokingly involves cops now.
Yeah.
Uh, or if I would even do it at all. Um, yeah,
No, that makes sense. I could see it swapping to wizard something else.
yeah, looking for some other wizardy fun. Um, but yeah, it was still pretty heavily like going, what do I find interesting from a theatrical or a physical point of view? But I think that's also just partially that's to do with the kind of games I like. Like there is something really interesting about games that have that physical, tangible element to them that I really like.
Yeah. Thinking about the games you've made some games that are often aping very sort of specific genre experiences. I've read your game, The Andromeda Ward, which is, really aping Garth Marenghi, which is two for two
Yeah.
Marenghi references on this podcast. You've done things about sitcoms. You have your like superhero saying trilogy. And I guess I was wondering when you are approaching something, I guess, with the starting point of what does Garth Marenghi look like in an RPG or etc. etc. What what do you often look at as the most sort of important things to be translating from one medium to another?
I mean, to a degree, it depends on the specific medium. Um, I think obviously because like with, for instance, Garth Marenghi, it's like it's so heavily about tone. It kind of almost with Garth Marenghi, it's almost less about what you're doing and more about how you're doing it because you need to be doing it shoddily, essentially. Um,
Any
and I
polish
think,
can get the fuck out.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think with Garth Marenghi's Dark Place, like when I was kind of taking a lot of cues from that, the point where I was like, ah, I know what this game is when I was like, okay, if you have a skill and you take an action that uses that skill, you roll your dice. If you have a skill and you use it in a way that makes absolutely no sense for that skill, then you roll with advantage. Um, because it's you know it's Dark Place, so it makes much more sense to shoot a gun in order to move a series of cardboard boxes around out of the way than it does to shoot a gun to actually hurt someone.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. You should always be asking why did you use the shovel?
yeah. And with other things, I think I don't know, when I made like the Fatality Force, which was inspired by the Suicide Squad, specifically James Gunn rather than the other version, that came more from a place of just seeing the film and being like, ah, I got I got hung up on the idea of Polka Dot Man and how he's throwing out polka dots and how that's almost a little bit like throwing your dice.
Oh
And
yeah.
I got hung up on the idea of like, wouldn't it be nice if like when I'm rolling my dice, it's to do something in character that has that same physicality to it. Um, and so Fatality Force, whilst it's technically a Suicide Squad inspired game, because it's still that thing of like it has the ridiculous like kind of kaiju-esque endpoint monster. It has it's written in a very specific voice, with a very kind of like flippant tone. Um, and it also kind of the nature of the powers and the supervillains slash superheroes that are at the center of it is a similar tone to the James Gunn movie of like this person has kind of stupid powers, but they can be fun in certain contexts. The actual starting point for that one was okay, how can I give everyone a core mechanic that um, physically mirrors what their character does? So it feels like you're physically doing that. Um, so to be honest, I think like for me, like it's what's like a really fun mechanic that kind of suits this world or this game, and then so much of it is for me just 'cause I mean like it's something that I love is the color, the tone, the fluff around it. Um, it's fun just writing lists of abilities for like a Merengue inspired game that's just like climbing, hand to hand combat, crabs, etc. Um, that feels like a very meandering answer.
No, that's really interesting.
But yeah.
It's also making me think about I didn't mention that like the print of the Andromeda Award is laid out like a stapled script, which I think ties into a lot of the stuff you're talking about with physicality. Like I imagine being
Mm.
someone running that and passing it around has this feel almost like you're being pulled in a bit of a sort of immersive direction.
Yeah, I like there are some beautifully designed books out there. Um, I mean, like probably top of the list has got to be something like Thousand Year Old Vampire, that feel like objects. And I love there's a brilliant game called This Person Should Not Exist or This Man Should Not Exist,
Oh
which is
yes.
it's all about basically wrecking a copy of Where's Wally. Uh, and it's so much fun working with like a physical actual thing. Um, and my latest kind of like obsession slash focus is like 70s 80s style textbooks. um
Like school
so
textbooks.
like school textbooks, academic textbooks, just like that very kind of 70s, 80s aesthetic of like slightly muted, ugly colors, um, and blocky text on the outside, and everything looks like a little bit shitty.
Oh,
Um, and the idea of having a textbook, like I
ooh.
released a game called Bridge, um, that was about uh, traveling to different universes.
So around this point is when Chloe and I got disconnected. We lost each other for maybe about 10 or so minutes, then we were able to re-establish the connection. So we'll fade back into the resumed chat, and there's just a bit where we try and find our place again. Apologies about that. Yeah, so we just got disconnected for a while, confusingly. So I'm not sure how Save the Recording did. It definitely got to the end of that question. I don't know if you cut off midway through or whether you end and then there's just a thing where there's an uncomfortable silence as we both realize we can't hear the other.
Yeah. Do you want me to do like a quick recap of
Where
anything?
were we at the end?
We were talking about, I think we were talking about like, I can't remember if we were talking about translating um like certain like genres, vibes, media into games, or whether we were at making things physical.
I think actually where we were, now I remember, is I think you're talking about this person doesn't exist. And then that's when I got disconnected.
Um, yeah. So I mean, yeah, if I was talking about this person doesn't exist, um, that's a really great game where you're kind of wrecking a Where's Wally book because um it's like your file of evidence of some cosmic series of events and this horrible harbinger of doom that is represented by Wally. Um, and yeah, I just find it really fascinating games that manage to present themselves as other things. So I've messed around with games that just look like kind of forms and paperwork, where it's just like if you're filling out paperwork about a weird expedition a la Annihilation, what story can be told, and also how can you make that something that still has like a lot of scope for different things to happen um, through that form and through that medium. And then yeah, the 70s textbooks and all that kind of stuff. I just find it really exciting when you can find games that just slot into the world in different ways.
Yeah, it is really fascinating. Jumping back to actually something you mentioned before, you were talking about like the sort of irreverent authorial voice of the Fatality Force. Do you feel like you have a consistent authorial voice, or do you think it is like you consciously change up to best suit the project?
And I think I think it changes with projects. I actually like asked friends on social media a few months back, like, how would you describe my brand? Because I can't really describe it. 'Cause that's one of the issues I have from like a more of a businessy or a marketing side, is that I just make whatever game I'm interested in.
I
And
remember the
sometimes,
first. Oh, sorry.
oh no, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, I remember the first time we met, we were introduced by our mutual friend Poe, who mentioned that I did games as well. And I think one of the first things you asked me was like, "Do you know how you describe what you do, or like the games you make? Because I can't."
Mm. Oh, you have such a good memory. I remember sitting in the theater around like in the little booth and stuff that night, but I do not remember the content of.
I'm surprised I have memory from that night.
Um, yeah, I find that a really hard thing to do because some people, you look at their games and you go, "Oh, I see." Like it's it's quick, it's chaotic, it's fun, it's schlocky, it's lots of different types of that. Or it's, "Oh, this is really considered emotional yet wrapped up in a fantastical setting kind of stuff, etc." Um, and for me, like sometimes it'll be very emotional and kind of stripped back and eerie, and sometimes it will be, now let's just blow things up and be really stupid and have hands made out of hammers and stuff. And from the responses I got from friends, like one of them I really enjoyed came up with the term, just all one word, sweet weird, to try and like capture the fact that often, like, I as a role player really like emotional role play. I really like stuff that's about friendships and relationships and that gets very emotional, um, and has that underlying everything. And I think they said sweet weird as the attempt to kind of capture the fact that I like stuff that has emotion and heart to it, but also like bizarro settings and contexts. Um, yeah, I've like entirely forgotten what the initial question was.
I was talking about authorial voice, and I think you answered it in terms of it is something that you vary a lot, um, which is definitely a skill. But I understand the frustration with that completely. As I think I've settled, like I think I also feel like a lot of my games are all different, and I feel I settle on saying like, oh, they're all sort of about alienation and connection. But I'm like, that is kind of me bullshitting about an emergent theme after the fact.
Yeah, it's nice to know that other people have that issue as well, because like most of the stuff you see, because it's from the people who have their shit together, um, it all feels kind of cohesive, or like their social media voice matches their authorial voice and stuff. And that's not me saying that these folks are putting on a performance or putting on some kind of fake voice. It's just that everything like flows so well together. Um, and I mean, I have that like as an issue across the board. I have three different websites because I have one that is just covering the stuff I publish as Roll Flip Draw. There's one that covers the Alongamy strand of projects, and then there's one that is just like I make theatre and also kind of games sometimes. Um, because it feels so hard to like cohere those into one clear thing. Um, yeah, I think the voice changes um a fair bit just depending on what the game is. That's also because I like games that sound like they're from a very specific person, or sound like they're written by a fictional character, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Like a lot of your games that I've read often do have this sort of specificity to the voice that I think is very strong, and I don't know, at least to me, is often more interesting than something super removed and uninvolved.
Yeah, yeah. Like I recently got, I've been waiting for this for a couple of years. I got a copy of Slug Blaster, um, which I supported on Kickstarter, and it has so many fun bits of that source book because basically it's about the idea that you're all playing teens, um, who are really into like a kind of teen subculture where people are in little groups, gangs, crews. Um, you can get sponsorship, and people have rivalries, and you know you all get involved in this, and parents maybe don't approve of it. Except the subculture is about skateboarding through interdimensional portals, and it's it has like really lovely bits and pieces in the source book, whether that's kind of fake posters of like this is your brain on slug blasting with the whole like cracked egg motif from the I don't know like 80s 90s advert.
Yeah, I
um
think it's a Dare thing or something.
yeah, um to having like little kind of notes in the margins and commentary, and it really captures like that whole, yeah, we're part of a cool subculture, and all of the slang it uses. Also, yeah, there's a MacGuffin and Co game, I think it is, and I want to say it's called, it's not Code Zero, it's not, it's something zero, Void, Zero Void. It's either Void Zero or Zero Void. Um, it's a really cool kind of like sci-fi um setting, and they have loads of like in-world slang, like little uh like vocabularies of in-world slang and stuff written down, and it's just such nice texture for the world and for the game.
Yeah, there's something like almost tactile about that, even though I'm talking about something that is text and language.
Yeah.
Are you a big reader much?
I was as a kid, and then I wasn't really in my 20s, and then about 3, 4 years ago, I got back into reading. So I now consider myself a moderate reader, I guess.
That makes sense. A medium-sized reader.
Yeah, yeah, a medium-sized reader.
Do you feel like stuff from more sort of you know, prose books, which are usually by their nature not interactive, do you feel that informs much of what you do in either theatre or in games, just in terms of, I guess, maybe thoughts about prose, word choice, or atmosphere creation?
Yeah, I mean it depends on the writer, obviously, but like there's a really beautiful book of short stories that I read, um, kind of like dipped in and out of last year called How Long Till Black Future Month by N.K. Jemisin, who's kind of a fan like science fantasy, sci-fi, etc. writer, like lots of Nebulas, lots of Hugos. Um, and what I really love about, well, I love many things about her writing, but she also does do really, really cool things with structure for her short stories. For instance, there's one short story, I can't remember. This is actually, I think this is the one I'm going to reference that's not in that book. Um, but it's written as the text for like a poster or an advert about a new housing estate or a new housing program. Um, and if anyone wants to like, it's available online. If you're listening to this and you want to go read it because I'm about to basically spoil what it is, and it's really fun to
Yeah,
see it unfold.
pause, then
Yeah,
come back.
it'll take you 10 minutes max to read. Who knows how long to find? Because I'm not giving you a title. Uh, but basically, you read this, and it's initially kind of setting like up. Oh, you're gonna anyone who's looking for cheap, affordable housing, this is the place to come. You're going to get all of these um, resources, all of these amenities. It's going to be great. And then you get to the terms and conditions. And it's only through the terms and conditions you're like, oh, I see. You sign up to this thing. You let a rich person use your body for 90 years as housing, as a resource, etc., as a vehicle. And that is your payment, essentially. And after the 90 years, then you get to live in a nice place. Um, and it's just the way that it's set up. She also has some in the short story that are kind of through like message forum postings. The story is told through that format. That's a really beautiful one that hits very hard, like post lockdowns. There's also ones where the chapters are out of order. Um,
Oh,
and like she does some really interesting stuff kind of structurally, but also just the worlds that she creates, you kind of they're the ones where you're like, oh, I want to play a game in that world. She has a short story called The City Born Great, where the concept is that kind of like legendary cities like Atlantis, for instance, are cities that have just grown to such a size that they become a living functioning thing, and they have to be kind of midwifed into being a living thing. And if that fails, then the city, it's going to close in on itself. It's going to collapse. It's going to fall to pieces and disappear and be left to legend. And New York City in the story is just at that point where it needs the midwife. It needs the person who can take it through. And you like accompany the midwife during the process of the city being born great. And the way things are described and what's happening, you're like, yeah, I want to play that game where I get to like help midwife a city into cosmic greatness. Um, so I'd say absolutely like non-interactive and non-gaming kind of media and literature definitely informs me when I'm thinking about games or just like need a bit of inspiration.
yeah, that sounds all really fascinating as well. I think the only thing I've read from N.K. Jemisin is a weird pull, probably, but she did a um, Green Lantern, like a 12-issue Green Lantern comic set on a city where emotion was outlawed, like ages ago, and so the drug trade is realistically all about like patches that allow people to experience emotion very briefly. Um,
Yeah,
it's interesting, yeah, but that just reminded me of that because it's stumbled out my words there. But yes, that reminded me of that.
yeah. I think something she does that's quite nice is just take things that feel normal or familiar and then match them up with something strange. So the fact that it's like emotions being outlawed, so you have like drugs, but it's for emotions. There's a story called Stone Hunger, which is about people who feed off of just matter. So it's about like how worlds and how places taste to them, and it's kind of, yeah, very interesting. But yeah, I think she's probably just like top of my mind just because I really utterly love her work right now. Um, both from like a kind of structural thing and from a world building perspective.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. An interesting thing I found talking to other designers, and I guess thinking about my own process, is a different role music sometimes plays in things. Does music and listening to music, is that much part of your process, or like either for inspiration, or do you write to music, or do you write in silence?
I rarely do anything in silence, to be honest. Um,
Yeah, same.
yeah, I'm the kind of person who will put on a single song and just listen to it on a loop, which I know for some people makes total sense, and for other people is just like, why would you do that? Because it's the same song for hours. Um, in terms of, well, music is one of the areas where I really like envy other people, because the thing is, I'm not a big video gamer. Like I play odds and sods, often kind of like weird indie bits on Steam and stuff like that, rather than say AAA titles. And my friends who run games that I play in, who are video gamers, have this huge library in their brains and also like actually on their laptops or their phones of incredible soundtracks. Like they will pull the most beautiful and apt orchestral instrumental music for moments in games, and I'll be like, this is so beautiful, where's it from? And they'll go, oh, it's from this edition of this game, it's the scene when this thing happens, etc. um and I don't have that as readily at my fingertips, and I really wish I did. um in terms of anything else, like I have some games that are like directly inspired by songs, because it's just that I've listened to that song so much that I'm like, oh, I really love that aspect of it. I love its tone, or I really like that lyric. That lyric sounds like a mechanic. Um, but I think it's very like, it's not a deliberate part of my process or anything. It's very chance based. Whether
That
it's just
makes
this
sense.
happens to catch me. Yeah.
Yeah, like pulling inspiration from what's around you. Did you listen much to the Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark soundtrack while working on Get Me Pictures of Spider-Man Turn Off? Get Me Productions of Spider-Man is the name, right?
Yeah, bring me productions of Spider-Man brackets turn off the dark. Um, yeah,
Was that all off
very.
the dome?
I think that's the one case where it's like it's wiser for your health and well-being to not listen to lots of that. Um, I have
Yeah.
listened. Yeah, I've listened to a lot of those songs on repeat, and I have one on my phone because there is one where you can get an official recording on iTunes. Um, but I didn't. It wasn't something that I listened to while making it. I did listen to the to like four tracks from the Suicide Squad soundtrack over and over and over, making Fatality Force.
That
I
makes
remember that
sense.
very, that was very vivid. But that's also because I tried to make that game. I was making it in 5 days because weirdly the film got released in the UK before America. So I was
Oh,
like, I've seen the film. It gets released in America in like 5 days. It would be really good if I could have this ready to go the moment it's
Yeah.
released in America. So I was just at other jobs, like waiting for rehearsals to start or stuff like that, just on my laptop with the music to just like focus in on it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess almost as a sort of focusing thing there.
Yeah.
So actually thinking about Spider-Man or Bring Me productions of Spider-Man, that's, a very sort of concrete merging of theatre and games as it's focusing on creating production in there. Would you like to talk a little more about that? Is that one of the games which has maybe been the most explicit thrust of that combination for you?
I think it I think it must be the most explicit. You probably don't get more explicit than like third part is just literally find what you can and stage your production after having like written it, rehearsed it, etc. Um, so it probably is, and I think it kind of like something that's always been really big for me, and it's one of the reasons why I enjoyed tabletop games in the first place, especially coming from like interactive and immersive theatre that often purports to be like you're going to be involved, you're going to be a participant, you're going to get to do stuff, you get to like affect what happens or like choose your story. Um, Having come from a background of that, and you can probably tell from my tone what I make of some of those claims. Um, and then coming to tabletop role playing, where it's like, oh no, we are genuinely making this together. We are genuinely telling the story together. This genuinely is a collaborative process with everyone involved. Um, that's something that I've always been really receptive to, and I've always enjoyed the kind of implicit, inherent thing for me in tabletop games that it tells everyone that their input is worthwhile and that them as storytellers are worthwhile. And that's like what I saw with a lot of the live shows, with people who were first time players who like had that moment where they suddenly realized they could actually just like say what they wanted to do and they could suggest anything, etc. And that would be like responded to. Um, and so that's always like kind of at the heart of games for me. And so I guess um Spider-Man, gaming production Spider-Man is partially like a very explicit thing of that. But it's also that for me a big part of those games is then going, okay, how do you what additional things can you do to get people to believe that they're good storytellers or they're good role players or that their creativity is valued. And I think there's something really nice about ending with, okay, you're now going to put on your show. And also because of the framing of it, it's fine if it's shit. There
Yeah,
is also that
it
kind of
will
sounds
have
a bit,
it will have a lower injury count probably than the actual Turn Off the Dark. So
yeah. Um, it will make more sense, most likely, as well. Like that probably sounds like a bit contradictory, me being like, you have worth as a storyteller versus it's fine if it's shit. Um,
I think
but
those are often two of the same sides though. Like your worth as a storyteller and that very I to me that does carry with it the sense that like polish and perfection and stuff is not what brings that worth.
yeah, that's a really nice way to put it. Because yeah, it's I think that's also one of the other things about what when I was saying earlier about the barrier of entry or the kind of love of entry for tabletop games with theatre. You've got kind of like you've got amateur dramatics and you've got professionals and you've got like the whole thing where sometimes community or amdram stuff is looked down upon. Um, and it's also super rarefied to actually be a professional in various ways and across various like spectrums and such like. But with tabletop games, yes, you do have like professional GMs or professional players and professional productions and stuff, but it feels like it is a space that is much more accepting of it. It can just be people having fun, and that is a legitimate. That is B like the big bulk of the industry slash community. Um, and it's nice that the core thing because okay, so obviously the dragon game there are lots of issues there, and I'm not going to get into like all the potential issues that can be taken with the dragon game. But as someone coming from a theatre background, where sometimes like people purport to give audiences agency when they actually don't trust audiences to use that agency, so they kind of end up patronizing them, controlling them, basically misleading them. Opening up, I think it's the player's handbook, and it's saying right at the very beginning, right from the top, on the one hand, I get it. It's a cop out to say this about your rule set. On the other hand, the fact that it goes right at the top, the most important thing is your fun. Like, if these rules aren't supporting your fun, you can flex them, you can get rid of them, you can homebrew stuff. The core thing here, the rule number one that is the immutable rule, is have fun. That's such a fucking brilliant thing. And um just anything that kind of like feeds into that, that supports people and having fun, that makes them feel less pressured to like be good at storytelling or be an amazing role player, and just actually do something fun that can also be shitty, because that's not the important metric here.
Mm.
And like you said, like polish and perfection and such like that's not the point.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really insightful, I feel. I realized there was something I didn't ask, which I usually ask, because we were talking about university earlier. And I guess there's what did you study when you were at uni?
I studied philosophy.
So
um
you didn't study theatre? Sorry, is that an invasive question?
no, it's not invasive at all. Like I've already been very open. I didn't get into drama school. uh so I studied philosophy because um I started doing it in sixth form, and my perspective then was, what's gonna not bore me for 3 years? Because you're at school and you're doing like at least five, like 4 or 5 different subjects, and you're studying them for a year, and then it's like, oh, you're gonna study one thing for 3 years. I was like, oh fuck, like
Yeah.
what if I'm gonna go to university? What am I still gonna find interesting after that much time spent on it?
Yeah, I work as a teacher now, and so help kids. Like part of my main job is like helping kids do their UCAS thing. And I had one kid who wanted to study film, and they're like, and their dad kept, oh, they should also try and apply for law because they'd be good at it. And I had to keep being like, both to the child more frequently, because I'd said this to the dad multiple times, it just seemed to wash off. Like, law's really
Yeah,
hard. Don't do it for 3 years you if you don't enjoy that. Like, she'll wash out because she doesn't care about law. Um, and then
yeah.
eventually, I was like, just go rogue, do a rogue application.
Nice. Yeah, precisely. Fortunately, like my parents, because of some of their own experiences with like parents, siblings, seeing people being made to do stuff that wasn't, their heart wasn't in it, they've always been pretty supportive. I mean, often baffled. Like, I'm not saying that they understand really what I do, but they understand that it's what I want to do and that it's important to me. Sounds like a really patronizing way of putting it. Like, Chloe wants to do it. It's very important to them. So just let them. But yeah, that like, and I think they were just. I think part of them was happy that I wasn't gonna do drama school. To be honest, they were probably happy that I was gonna go to university instead. Um, but yeah, so philosophy. Um, I think the stuff that I studied, like, it made me think a lot more in terms of like systems. I kind of noticed that when I was working in theatre, I would often come across a lot of like directors who had studied English lit. Like, that was the most common thing, it felt, for directors to have studied rather than philosophy. And it felt like English lit directors approach things from a sense of like scenes, acts, beats in a scene, like that kind of linear structure. And I would approach things from like, oh no, well, if this character says this, that means XYZ is true of the world. Cool. And it was much more of like a kind of world building, thing before I knew the term world building. Um, and also I think like there's certain preoccupations that I have that probably trace back to like the curious thing of like the mind body problem, or like how your mind relates to your body, and like having done art like essays on identity at university, or having sessions on time travel at university and things like that. There were only a few, but it was still really cool that that was like part of the curriculum. I
Sessions on time travel.
yeah, I disagreed thoroughly with what was being said about time travel. But the hard thing about time travel is it's very difficult to have concrete disagreement on
Yeah, yeah,
something
it
that
is a disagreement purely about vibes, and trust me.
yeah, yeah, it's just let's disagree about vibes. Um, but then again, the coolest job title I've ever had is time travel consultant, which was for a show that was dealing in time travel and wanted me to come up with like how it was going to get described in world and what type of time travel we were going to have.
Oh, you
The
also have the time travel heist game, which I'm
that was
blanking on the name of.
a time heist.
Time heist. That I should have
That
been
was
able to guess that.
no, that's don't worry. Time heist was genuinely one of the reasons I got that. I was asked to do that job.
Oh, okay. They were like
We
they were out looking for a time travel expert.
They were like, we know Chloe from some other things, but Chloe has also evidently done a lot of thinking about time travel, mechanizing time travel, describing it, etc. Um, so yeah, I think it's things like that's kind of really stuck with me from philosophy. But philosophy? Yeah, I did say that right. For a moment, I was like, I've said the word wrong, but I think that's just my brain like crumbling. Um, yeah, it's kind of it's a really good. I think it's a really good subject for thinking about overall structure. And to be honest, like you're doing a lot of logic stuff, which helps sometimes with approaching mechanics and things like
Mm.
that. Um, so there's kind of bits and pieces, even if I'm not like doing games that are about Hume versus AJ Ayer or whatever. Um,
Even if you're not putting them in the gladiatorial ring of combat, there's still that influence.
yeah, yeah. There's still those bits and pieces that kind of trickle through.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think I will draw us to a close here. Thank you so much for coming on the pod. I enjoyed this conversation immensely. Are you able to talk about anything that you are working on at the moment?
Um, Bits and pieces. So I'm first going to say thank you for having me because I'm worried I will forget if I don't say it now. And it's also been a really lovely conversation on my end. Thinking about stuff that I haven't in absolute years. In terms of things I'm working on now that I can talk about, um, oh gosh, yeah, there is not a huge amount that I'm allowed to currently talk about. So there's a few tabletop games that I'm kind of very slowly, it's like a slow and steady thing of developing. One of them has been in the works for a little while now and is called Lawbreakers, but law spelled Lore.
Mm.
See what I did there? Um, which is essentially the idea is one division, but make it tabletop. So it's made as a 4 session game where a group of characters are moving through different. You play the same characters through different classic tabletop settings and realities, and over the course of the game, you're trying to figure out. You're trying to first realize that something weird is even happening, and then you're trying to figure out, wait, I'm sure that I've heard someone say the same thing, but in a cyberpunk world, why are we now high fantasy? Haven't I also seen you in like a cosmic horror somewhere before, etc.
That's
But
fun. Like
yeah,
Dorothy realizing mid Oz, oh, you were here.
yeah, and it's one that I've play tested, and it's been really fun to play test because the flexibility of it has meant that when a player hasn't been able to attend a session, I've been able to like record their voice and have them as like a glitch in the system or something like that. Of like, well,
Ah,
this oh wait, there's a person we forgot about. Yeah, that person exists. So yeah, working on Lawbreakers, there's a LARP that I'm kind of developing and hoping to have as something that people can buy tickets for once kind of Halloween comes around, because that's Transmission, which is my loosely put my haunted teletext LARP, which is a lot of fun. I've been playtesting that, and basically you pretend to be friends isolated during the Great Storm of 1987, but then teletext starts broadcasting in the middle of the blackout, and it's kind of me on a homemade teletext emulator doing a lot of bits and pieces, uh, but having a huge amount of fun with it. And aside from that, I don't. It's really annoying because there's some potentially very cool stuff, but that also sounds like a really like jerk thing to say. Oh, so many cool things. I can't talk
Well,
about them.
where can people find you and follow you and pay attention to you so they know when you are allowed to talk about this cool stuff?
People can pay attention to me at um, I'm Chloe Mashiter on Twitter. I think I'm Chloe Mashiter on Instagram. I'm still comparatively new there, which is why I don't know off the top of my head. I'm Roll Flip Draw on Itch. Um, there's also rollflipdraw.co.uk. There's Chloe Mashiter makes things.wordpress.com, because I refuse to pay money for that one, so it still has the WordPress suffix. I think that covers most of the places. There is, if you go to rollflipdraw.co.uk, there is a mailing list where normally every month, but if things are a bit quieter, it'll be every few months, because I'm not going to send out mail outs if I don't have something to say. I'm not going to just spam people with stuff for the sake of regularity. But that's a good place to keep up with what I'm doing. And there's also alongame.com, which is where there's updates about the Along Me project, which is much more kind of LARP meets theatre, etc. stuff. Because I will be doing future versions of the Shield and Torch, which was the kind of fantasy tavern LARP that I was running. But just currently looking over money and funding for that one.
Yeah, the old chestnut. Thank you so much once again. And I'm still working out sign-offs for this series, but for tonight I'll try. Good night, cruel world.